Kia ora koutou, I'm Nic Toki, New Zealand's Threatened Species Ambassador, and this is the Doc Sounds of Science podcast. Kia ora, ko Nic Toki tēnei. He konai I pirangi tēnei e pā ana ki ngā Sounds of Science. Every episode, we talk about the work being done behind the scenes by Doc's technical experts, scientists, rangers, and the experts in between. Today, we have lizard expert Lynn Adams on the show. Lynn, let's talk lizards.
Kia ora, Nic. Ko Lynn Adams toko ingoa. Kei te papa atawhai ahau I mahi ana. My name's Lynn Adams and I work for the Department of Conservation.
Kia ora. Lynn, let's talk a little bit about your role. From my understanding, you're the lizard queen. But can you just tell us a little bit about your role at DOC?
Quite often get princess, but not queen. So I'm a technical advisor here at Department of Conservation, which essentially means that I give advice to people around conservation programs and how to recover things. But my specialty is around lizards, New Zealand lizards.
What got you into that? What did you study? What was your passion that led you here?
Well, to be honest, my passion was birds, and I shouldn't tell my lizard friends that, but it's possibly still true. And so I went to university for about 5 years. I did a master's degree, and I did it on kaki, black stilts, because I really love birds. And then I got a job in the department and realised that actually we've got quite a lot of people who are really good at looking after birds. But we had very few people looking after lizards, so I got a real insight into some of the problems that we've got with New Zealand lizards and realised that we've got this big gap in our conservation management, and so that led me down the path around conservation management of lizards, New Zealand lizards.
I think birds do get a lot of attention, so I for one am quite glad that you kind of diverted course off the birds and onto the lizards. How many lizard species have we got in New Zealand? I know this is a very complex, controversial kind of question, but roughly, ballpark, what are we looking at here?
So you're right. You'd think that someone who's an expert on lizards would know that sort of basic question, but it's actually really hard. So we've probably got around 109
species.
109 species. And the reason it's really hard to know exactly how many is we're still finding new ones. So I'm not quite sure in that 109 whether I've accounted for the new species that we found in Kaharangi a year ago. And then there's 3 new species found in Central Otago, and I'm pretty sure that's not in the count too. So we might have to add 4 more species to that in the near future.
How can it be possible, though, that in this modern world, New Zealand isn't terra incognito, we kind of have mapped out most places in the country. How on earth could we still be stumbling over new species and not have seen them before?
Actually, in the lizard world, we probably are a little bit terra incognito in that there's lots of places that we don't go, and of the few people who do go there, they're possibly doing other things and not looking at their feet where the lizards are. The other thing about it is that lizards are super sneaky, so they're really good at hiding in vegetation, and they're really good at avoiding detection. And so even when we go out looking for them, we really struggle to find them when we're looking for them. And it's actually one of our big problems is that we can't reliably find them, so we can't ever say that there's definitely none here.
Just as a side note, I'm also a lizard nerd. I have quite an affinity to our lizards, particularly our geckos. But it fascinates me that New Zealand always gets described as a land of birds. I suppose because they're so visible to us. Do you think in reality we would best be described as a land of lizards?
We're just unique in everything, so our lizards are super unique. Certainly pre-European times, there would have been lizards everywhere. For a lot of us who go to the high country in the South Island, there's some really amazing hotspots up in the high country there, and that's the sort of diversity and abundance that we would have seen before predators hit New Zealand.
What is it about our geckos and skinks that make them different to their cousins in the tropics, for example?
So there's the obvious things like they give birth to live young. Most of the lizards overseas lay eggs and then they hatch. Our New Zealand ones don't. They give birth to these beautiful little miniature lizards, and then quite a lot of the species have some quite intensive parental care, we suspect. So we just don't know that much about most of our species, but I won't be surprised if a lot of our species have quite intense parental care, which is kind of another thing that we associate with reptiles or with lizards. We kind of think that they're cold and they don't do much thinking and that they don't do the things that mammals and birds do, but I actually suspect we're a little bit off on that thinking.
So you were a bird specialist, actually on one of my favourite species, the black stilt or kaki. How long have you been involved with lizards, and what was it that really kind of grabbed your attention and made you realise that somebody needed to care about them?
Well, to be honest, I spent most of my childhood roaming around the Canterbury High Country, and so I was constantly encountering lizards. And so I admit that I was right into lizards right from an early age. But I think the thing that really grabbed me from a conservation perspective was over time seeing some of those populations disappear, but then also seeing some of the amazing diversity that we've got. So on some of our offshore islands that I got to when I started working for DOC, I started seeing some of the massive skinks that were completely different from anything I'd ever encountered on the mainland. So, and they were awesome. Big dinosaurs who look at you as if they might eat you. Kind of they look over their shoulder and look up at you and feel a little bit uneasy when they look at me. I mean, and to give you a sense of scale, they're not huge. So if you think about some of the Australian reptiles, they're nothing like that. My understanding is that the one animal that's kind of the record length, if an average sized person lays out their arm and measures from their elbow to their tips of their fingers, that's how long that animal is. So that's an animal called a robust skink. It's in captivity, which is why we know it so well, and I might have to admit that it's possibly been looked after too well. It might be a wee bit overweight, but it's huge, really big animal.
There was a bigger one though, wasn't there? A bigger species of gecko.
Yes.
Do you know about that one?
So it's called a Delcourt's gecko. It's extinct. So it was this huge gecko that roamed around New Zealand, and who knows what it did, but it's gone. And I suspect that there's a lot of species that have gone that we've never recorded and that we'll never know about because they're so small, relatively so small. We don't get the fossil records. We don't get bone deposits in our limestone caves like we do with a lot of our birds.
What's the hardest part of your job in terms of looking after these lizards?
Oh, the hardest part is that we don't know how to manage them. So when I say that, it's a little bit of a headline statement, but it feels like we're in the place that bird conservation was in the 1960s. And by that I mean we actually know a lot about ecology in New Zealand that we didn't know in the 1960s, but we don't have management tools to protect lizards from predators. So the predator control that we do around the country, which is amazing and super effective at protecting our birds, is just not good enough for lizards. And so our lizards are declining still in the places that we're doing pest control. And so in that way I feel a little bit helpless in that we don't just have an instant solution for management of lizards. So when people come to me and say we want to look after our lizards in our backyard, I don't have a silver bullet, I don't have a magic answer. That's kind of sad, but it's also where I get a lot of the energy for the job as well, because that's where we need to go. We need to develop those tools and we need to develop our techniques. We need to get better at pest control.
Yeah, and I think when it comes to lizards, the real challenge for people is understanding it's not your normal suite of predators necessarily that are impacting on them. Is it?
That's right. And so we think of predators in New Zealand commonly. If the first thing that comes to mind is stoats and rats, and maybe we might be thinking about cats in the lizard context, but actually the information that we've got suggests that mice are the worst predators, and it's because they are super productive. They can produce lots of babies and they have lots of litters every year, and they feed on stuff that's common like grass seed, and they just go through these crazy explosions that our pest control tools just can't get on top of.
Well, how does a mouse eat a lizard?
So lizards are cold-blooded. They work by sitting in the sun, as we know. We've probably seen them sitting in the sun, and that's the way they warm up. So on a cold day, they literally can't move, and so on the cold day, there's these little bundles of protein that mice can come up and nibble on. And we occasionally see lizards that we've caught that have been preyed on by mice, and they'll just be chewed away. So little wee gnawing chews on the side of the body that ultimately kills them.
While it's still alive.
Terrible. It's terrible.
That is awful.
That's what's happening in New Zealand, just with ordinary sized mice. With our lizards, we just don't see it.
Yeah, that's a major, and I do know that it's something that our scientists in the department are wrestling with right now, isn't it? Is how we're going to get our heads around what we do about the mice. I think another predator that always goes under the radar, and always ends up being controversial every time I mention it, and boy does that Beatrix Potter have a lot to answer for, is the bloomin' hedgehog. Tell us about what hedgehogs do to lizards.
So hedgehogs are pretty cute, but they do exactly the same as mice. So when those lizards are cold and they can't move, those hedgehogs will be the opportunistic feeders, so they'll be gnawing away at their lizards.
I'm always fascinated by people who, and this will be controversial, so I look forward to your feedback. Often people will talk about leaving out bread and milk for the hedgehogs or cat biscuits or whatever, and my response to that is, would you leave something out for a stoat? Or a rat?
Exactly.
Because it's the same thing.
It's exactly the same thing. And it's just that we're not seeing it. Like they don't attack things in the middle of the day when we can see it. They're gnawing away at those lizards when they can't move. And so, because
they're just shut down at night, aren't they? They're basically solar powered.
Oh, yeah.
So they're just like lying there while a hedgehog on his stumpy wee legs is just, So take home message. Get your hedgehog feeding off your...
Stop your hedgehog feeding.
Off your menu. Put a trap in your backyard. I think the most obvious impact that you can see or experience in terms of predators on lizards is when you go to places where there are no predators, right? And so, not to show off, but yesterday I was on Hoturu or Toi, or Little Barrier Island. I think there's something like 14 species of reptile on that one island, all happily cohabitating in their various ecological niches right across the island and all doing really well because there's no predators, right?
Exactly. And so there's heaps of species, lots of diversity. And I bet you when you jumped off your boat, you were almost kicking them out of the way as you walked through the grass. And that's the sort of abundance that we just don't see in the mainland. But that's normal. That's how New Zealand should be. We should be flushing them away as we walk through the grass.
What's something about the work that you do that you wish everybody out there knew?
I wish they knew a lot more than they do just about lizards. I'd realise how amazing they are and that they're not just the little brown jobs in your backyard. In fact, there's an amazing book out that everyone should have at home. It's a handbook and you can flick through it. I flick through it for hours on end and look at every single lizard, and you'll see the diversity there. I also really wish people could see some of the habitat destruction that's still happening. So we're absolutely losing populations through predation, but we've also got habitat loss. And habitat in New Zealand, we generally don't think that we're losing habitat, but actually in the lizard context we are. And it's because there's so many species, they live in such diverse places.
I think you've touched on something really important there, Lynn, because I think we're a bit simplistic in New Zealand in terms of what we think the conservation areas are. We tend to think they're the bush. So if they're the bush, the forest, that's where the nature is, and it's not everywhere else. And of course, the lizards are everywhere else, aren't they? I mean, they are in the bush, but the places that I think of in terms of being perfect homes for particularly some of our green gecko species are generally what farmers would consider scrub.
Yeah.
So the sort of Manuka, Kanuka, Caprosma, Matagari, that kind of Muhlenbeck, that stuff is a bit messy.
Yeah.
It's kind of the stuff you want to tidy up.
Well, the good news about that, though, is for gardeners, is that messy is great. Lizards love messy.
I think maybe that's why I have such an affinity to lizards then, because it's that messy
You're
is
allowed
good.
to be messy, Nick.
Yeah.
You're allowed.
Messy is good. Get out there and mess up your gardens. Great. So what do you think's been your most satisfying experience professionally when it comes to all the lizard work that you've been involved with?
Oh, so that's a tricky one. Maybe I need to wait a few years, but I think Chesterfield skink's been a pretty amazing project, and we're still a wee way away from saving those species. So Chesterfield skink lives on this fairly unremarkable piece of beach just north of Hokitika. It's a nationally critical species, and we've done a reasonable amount of research on it over the last 3 to 4 years.
Is that the one with the curly whirly tail?
Curly whirly.
I love this one.
Yes, curly whirly. So that was a name that we gave to a skink. It curls its tail, its whole body actually curled up into this. It's like a curly fry.
Yeah,
it's like,
or like a Mr. Whoopi.
Mr. Whoopi.
Ice cream.
Or a turd, I've been told.
Seems we're always going to go there in this podcast.
That aside, so the reason it's got a nice curly whirly tail is because we think it's probably arboreal, so they use that tail, just like monkeys do, to grip onto forests. And so the species is now living on the coast, on the beach. It was probably coastal forest back in the day, and it's all been cut down. It's lost most of its habitat. It's probably been preyed upon by all the mice and cats and hedgehogs in the world, and it's now down to a population of 200. We had a major setback last year with Cyclone Fahey, which I'm sure lots of people are going to remember that one. It was a really damaging cyclone, and what happened at our Chesterfield skink site was that on their little safe, we thought was safe beach site, there were these massive waves, massive tides, which overwashed them. The whole entire population was overwashed over a couple of tides, and so I got that news when I was sitting in Invercargill doing some other work, and I actually thought that we'd lost the whole species. So that was my worst day. There were a few tears.
I'm not surprised.
There were a few tears. But when we realised the damage that had happened, I jumped on the phone to Auckland Zoo. Auckland Zoo said, I think we could probably help you there. Give me a day to figure out whether we can take some animals into captivity for you as a safeguard. And a day later, we'd had a plan to get some animals up into the zoo, into captivity where they'd be safe. So we ended up doing that over a couple of months, and it turned out that I don't know what those skinks were doing during that storm, but it turned out that most of them have probably survived.
What?
Yeah, I just don't know what they would have done. Like, it was
Under salt water. Twice.
Pounding seas. Like, anyone on the coast at the time has told me the stories of what the sea was like at the time. My best guess is that they live in burrows and they just hang on, and maybe there were some air pockets down there, but I don't even really know how they breathed during that time. So we've got a secure population up at Auckland Zoo, and they're doing a great job of looking after those. And our next job, so this is why the story isn't over yet, the next job is for us to build a fence, to find a place that we could put them that's safe from storms, and to get those animals at Auckland Zoo back into the wild in a safe place away from predators.
So you've got basically an entire species sitting in the zoo? Not
quite. So we did one of our research trips just down there recently, and we've got, and there'll be more, but we found 52 animals down there. So we've at least got 100 animals. There's probably more. So between 100 and 200 animals remaining.
Still, that's
it's
getting
pretty
right
dire.
Down there. I mean, people we hear a lot about kakapo.
Yeah.
And there are 147 adults, and, everybody's pretty freaked out about a number that low, and yet here are these populations of skinks that probably no one's ever heard of that are down to the same level.
And to be honest, now, because we've been talking about Chesterfield skinks for a wee while, and Chesterfield skinks is probably relatively well known compared to some of the other species, which some of them are in worse situation.
I think that's the challenge, though, isn't it, Lynn, for you guys working, when you're working as an ecologist, when you get populations or species down to such low numbers or in such sort of fragmented places, any impact in addition to that becomes essentially a threat to their very survival, right?
Yeah, a storm, a cyclone, was the last thing we were thinking of with Chesterfield skinks. So we were focused from day one. We really knew nothing about those species. We didn't even know how to identify them. So every animal that we took, we had to have confirmed genetically. Luckily, we've figured out how to identify them. And we didn't know the breeding, we didn't know the extent of where they were, we didn't know what their threats were, we had some best guesses about mice. So there were a whole heap of questions that we were trying to answer in those first 3 years, and storm damage was the last question on our mind. And then suddenly the storm hit, and so we had to completely change tact and change everything that we were planning for that species.
Yeah, and I guess another kind of growing risk through climate change impacts on weather.
Absolutely.
That we're going to have to keep an eye out for.
Yeah, and I just look at all the storms. I am looking out for storms now. They are getting more frequent.
You have to get pretty good at lizard identification, and I know that one of the problems with trying to discern what the different species are is they all look the same, particularly some of those skinks. I've talked to you guys before, and you've said things to me like, "Oh, no, you've got that wrong. You count the scales behind the eyeball." So your lizard ID has to be pretty switched on, doesn't it? Tell us a little bit about what's involved in, visually identifying some of those lizards.
So it's hard because it's hard. So even our experts who do count the scales, one of the tools we use to figure out who's different and who's not, but even those guys who do that are often stumped. So they are kind of all the same. But when you get to know them, they're really different. So it's like anything, if you know something really well, you can start to see the differences. And sometimes when we're first starting out, we find something new, we think it's new, it kind of feels different and it doesn't look quite the same and it's doing different stuff and it's got two more scales than it should have. We often have to confirm with genetic techniques, and we've got some really sophisticated genetic techniques now that can tell us definitively the different species. Once we know that, we can then split them into those two groups or whatever, and we can start seeing the differences by eye. So we can count the scales, and we can confirm that it should have 2 extra scales behind its eyeball, and we can start seeing some of the colour differences. We start seeing differences in the proportions of their body shape, and it is really subtle, and it sounds tediously boring, but it's actually really exciting when you can tell a lizard apart from another one.
So we have had a question come to us from Twitter, and somebody has asked us, what's the biggest threat to tropical lizard species?
I suspect habitat loss, to be honest. I think in a lot of countries, habitat loss is still a massive problem.
And maybe climate change.
Yeah, so interestingly, some lizards can change their sex depending on the temperature that the eggs are incubated at. It still blows my mind. I've known that for a little while, but it still blows my mind. So climate change will have a massive impact on those sorts of species where warming will create more boys than girls.
Yeah, and we've seen that in tuatara, which is not a lizard, by the way, which is a reptile. I know that in some populations, tuatara are already skewing towards more males hatching as a result of that warming of the soil where the eggs are buried.
Yeah. In that particular case, it's probably because the vegetation has been degraded through various activities through the decades. It's not looking great for tuatara in New Zealand.
What should people do if they find a lizard?
The most common way is that their cat brings in a lizard. So the best thing to do is obviously to take it off the cat and then release it into a safe area. So don't release it to a place where the cat can catch it again. But if you've got some of those divaricated shrubs or spiky shrubs that your cat doesn't like going into, that's the place to release it. The other really good thing to do, if you can, is if you're sneaky, if your cat hasn't got hold of it, is to try and sneak up and take a good photo of it. Especially if you're not in an urban area. Like urban areas, we pretty much know what species we've got. It's still useful to get information from urban areas, but if you're in a remote place, you're out tramping in the back blocks of nowhere and you see a lizard, that is actually a really good thing that gives us our first clues about where to look for lizard populations. So if you can take a photo, please try and make it clear. I know it's really hard, but we get so many times we get blurry photos of this stick-like thing. It's not helpful. And if you can't get a good photo, because I do understand it's really difficult, they're moving and it's hard to get close to them, definitely send in the report. Send in whatever. Send in an email to your local doc office, and tell them as much as you can about it, the location, what sort of habitat it was in, what sort of weather conditions it was, who you are, so we can go back to you and talk to you about it if it's something really interesting. All of that information gives us our best clues, and it's that sort of record that leads us to new species. Like we've had rock climbers who have said, we saw these lizards while we were rock climbing, but we never got any photos.
Sinbad skinks.
New species, Sinbad skinks, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I think that's really cool to think out there that the public could be contributing to some new scientific discovery, and that you guys are really keen to hear from them about what they're seeing out there. Yeah,
backcountry, like South Island in particular, but not exclusively, South Island high country in the mountains, in the really remote places. We got literally no records of lizards from southern Fiordland. So anyone who's in there sees anything is going to be hugely significant.
It's been really amazing talking to you, Lynn, because you are describing a new generation of conservation pioneers. You know, you're describing things that I read about, you know, when the Wildlife Service were out doing the same surveying for birds, trying to work out how to solve the problems of predation, all that kind of stuff. You're quite right. We're kind of poised on the precipice of exactly the same story now, but for lizards, and I feel like we're in good hands. Like I feel like the passion that you guys have for these lizards is setting us in a pretty good stead, given those massive challenges, the mice, the hedgehogs, the impacts of climate change. I feel like we probably are going to crack this, right?
Yeah, and you know, the thing that I'm really looking forward to is all of the people after me who are going to stand on my shoulders and look down at me and go, why didn't you guys know this? That'll be great. I'd love to have everyone in a few generations' time saying, Lynn, why didn't you do this with our lizards? And have all those tools available and lizards running all over the lands, us flushing them away as we walk through the grass. Wouldn't that be awesome?
That would be amazing. I look forward to that too, and I can't think of a more perfect way to wrap up. So, Lynn, thank you so much for your time and for your passion and energy and expertise. And I look forward to hearing about your next discovery. Thank you. That's it for this episode. If you like what you heard, show us some love with a 5-star rating. The Doc Sounds of Science podcast is available wherever you get your podcasts, so subscribe now and never miss an episode.